Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get ready to get started with our Meetup event, which we're gonna be reviewing again every other week. We review one of the Chinese cultural concepts in the Chinese honeymoon period, and we talk about it in the proper cultural context. So what we really want to do is we want to practice how we develop Guanxi with our colleagues, partners, and employees in China. And this, of course, can extend to also government stakeholders. But basically, how do you develop Guanxi in the Chinese cultural context? Okay, everything is based on this book that I published in February. It's called The Chinese Honeymoon Period. And it basically takes 10 Chinese cultural concepts as the foundation for being able to solve a certain set of challenges and problems. Most of them are emotional and psychological, and it's basically how do you get the most out of your cooperation with your Chinese counterparts, and how do you avoid a lot of the classic frustrations illustrated here in this page right here, where one side is saying 但我的意思是 and the other side is saying 那不是我的意思. Okay, so there's a couple expressions we always talk about. This can be referred to as 鸡同鸭讲 or 牛头不对马嘴. And basically what happens in these types of conversations, and it's not exclusive to foreigners and Chinese people. Chinese people always have these types of conversations amongst themselves, even though there are no language barriers, which is why we say knowing how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. But the situation that we're trying to avoid is represented by this phrase, 恶性循环. And it's basically a circular conversation that I'm sure you've all experienced that starts to escalate and basically gets out of control, which means you spend 30 minutes to an hour or longer debating something that is irrelevant to the main points that you want to cover and the objectives that you want to achieve. All right. So the first thing that we always want to do, not only in these events, but when you meet anybody in China, is you want to warm up. Okay. I say warm up because this is something that most Westerners can understand. You need to warm up. And this is where basically we introduce ourselves. Okay. Even if you're meeting people that you already know or even are familiar with, you still have some type of greeting that sets the tone for how you're going to interact when you see each other. And this is called 自我介绍. Now, obviously, if you're familiar with a person, you don't have to introduce yourself, but you still want to get into the mindset that there's a proverbial warm-up period. How you send your greetings to the other side, the attitude that you have, the facial expressions and the mannerisms that you have. In Chinese, we call it liǎnsè. That will have a very oversized influence on how that conversation will go. It's called liǎnsè. It basically describes the mannerisms that you have on your face, and it's reflected by the attitude that you currently have towards a set of things or towards a particular thing. And that 脸色 will often dictate whether the conversation that you have goes in a positive direction or it goes into a negative direction. So this is something that we should all be conscious and kind of aware of. So every meeting or engagement begins with a warm-up. Okay. And as I said, it's to set the tone for what's to come next. But if you're meeting somebody for the very first time, you're trying to do several things in this, what I would actually call an opportunity. The 自我介绍 is basically an opportunity for you to set the right tone for the type of conversation or discussion that you want to have, and start to exchange some goodwill and reciprocity, which will set the tone for the type of Guanxi relationship that you're going to develop. So a lot of things are happening simultaneously during these warm-up sessions. 了解彼此, okay, understand each other. 摸透对方 to understand what the other side really values. 表达诚意 which is to express some goodwill, and to 做关系 in the context of doing business in China. Everything is based on developing Guanxi. So this is all the things that you're trying to set in motion during the warm-up period. And 彼此 is basically an expression that basically says, I'm with you. We're together in the same boat. Whatever you're willing to offer me, I'm definitely willing to reciprocate and even try to offer you more. So what happens in this type of relationship is both sides are trying to outdo the other in pleasing each other, giving each other more value, more goodwill, more things to help move the partnership forward. And this is a continuous cycle. And if you develop these types of relationships, it only gets better over time. All right. So I'm going to skip this section. This is basically how I explain what the intention of these meetups are. And of course, we take these 10 Chinese cultural concepts. And the point of this slide really is to talk about the words that we want to say in English that we try to translate its meaning into Chinese probably is not going to convey the meaning that we want. And so sometimes it's more important not to try to figure out the translations of all the words that you're trying to say, but it's more important to be able to convey your meaning in the proper cultural context. And what I did is I broke down this very simple English phrase and talked about the literal translation and the actual meaning. So if you really want to see this kind of discussion, you can go back and watch a replay video of some of the older or previous meetup events. All right. So the agenda is we've already done the introductions, 自我介绍, but we're going to do a deep immersion into one of the 10 Chinese cultural concepts in the Chinese honeymoon period. And then, of course, in your book, and we can do them here also if you've already read the chapter, is there are thought questions or empathy exercises. This really is intended to trigger your imagination and help you deploy more purpose-driven curiosity to your interactions with your Chinese counterparts. Because it's only through curiosity and imagination that you will actually be able to make breakthroughs that your normal ego-driven, myopic mind would not be able to make. All right. So this is my introduction. I'm going to go through this really quickly. I want to share the environment in which I was raised. I was born and raised in the United States. So for me, it's very important to convey that to whoever I'm introducing myself to. I also want to discuss the environment in which I was raised to lower the expectations that I would really have a deep understanding of Chinese culture. And if I mispronounce something or are not sure of some Chinese terms and phrases, I'll be given the benefit of the doubt because you can see in these images, this is the environment in which I was raised. And that would be completely different than the environment in which my Chinese counterparts would have been raised. I also want to talk, one of the things is Chinese people like to know you personally. Okay, so I would talk about my marriage. I married someone from mainland China. We met in the US, but she is from Hunan. So I would talk about where she was raised. Somebody in China would probably reference girls from Hunan as 香妹子, okay, because it's the food that's represented in the culture of Hunan, very spicy. And sometimes they give that reference to also the women from that region. And it's really an icebreaker that kind of starts to build that connection where you understand where your wife is from, some of the local references to not only cuisine, but also to the things that they like to joke about. Okay. I also like to talk about the native place, which is where you're originally from, your ancestral background. And when you see two Chinese people meet each other for the very first time, they usually ask the question, 你老家在哪? where is your ancestral home or your native place? And so what I like to do is I like to say, even though I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, I like to say my ancestral place, 我老家是江苏淮安. My ancestral home is Jiangsu Province, Huai'an Prefecture. And then I make this reference. 周恩来的老家. It's the same hometown as the first premier of the People's Republic of China. So this really helps set the tone of, even though I was born in this environment where you see there are no Chinese kids where I was being raised, I know where I'm from. We have common roots, and my ancestral roots go back to China. And this helps create a greater opportunity for reciprocity down the road through these common connections. All right? So all of this is based on this book that I wrote called The Chinese Honeymoon Period. And you can see that in these pictures, these static images, it really looks like a honeymoon. It really looks like everything is great. And these are some of the things that you're going to experience as a foreigner when you first go to China, because Chinese people are some of the most hospitable people in the world, and their propensity to give face and to show respect and try to demonstrate goodwill will make you feel like you're being treated like royalty. And the point is the Chinese honeymoon period is a facade, in a sense that you still have to reciprocate and you still have to deliver, and you don't want to be misled that everybody agrees with your opinions and the things that you say, even though on the surface everybody's nodding their head, smiling and laughing. All right, so the whole point is 但是没有你想象的那么容易. Okay, so this is analogous to any kind of marriage. You know, when you're looking at the honeymoon photos or the wedding photos, everything looks great, but it's never as easy as it appears on the surface, which is why I coined the phrase, knowing how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. All right, so there are 3 books in this series. I'm currently writing the 3rd book after the honeymoon as we're doing these events. So as we're breaking down each one of these practical definitions into the proper Chinese cultural context, we're talking about what insights do we need to really acquire, and how best are we to position ourselves and engage with people given our new understanding of the proper Chinese cultural context. That is the 3rd book in this series, called After the Honeymoon Period. And of course, everybody who has a copy of either book, Everything We Know About China or the Chinese Honeymoon Period, will get access to the Google Doc, which is the working manuscript where you can provide comments and make feedback and basically be a part of writing this book if that's something that you have, you know, a desire to do. So anyway, you'll have access to all of that. And of course, you'll be able to attend all of these discussions that we're going to have as we really dig deep into the empathy exercises and the thought questions for each of the 10 chapters of the book. All right? Yeah, like I said, it's on a Google Doc. All right, so the fundamental question that we all should be asking is, what are we experiencing psychologically when communicating across cultural differences? All right, psychology is 心理学. All right, and my answer is we need to imagine that art of war tactics are always being used against us, okay? And it's to gain a competitive advantage. And it's likely that the way to think about it is it's likely that our Chinese counterparts are using these tactics subconsciously, okay? Because 99% of the people in China have actually never read the original text of the Art of War, okay? But this is a good way to frame it, because if you think about it as a competition with tactics and strategy, it makes it less personal when Chinese people say something or do something that might make you angry, for example. Okay, so think about it as art of war tactics that are being used against you subconsciously. And our goal is to understand or develop the ability to counteract its negative effects. And the negative effects are the negative effects it has on us emotionally and psychologically. For example, getting frustrated, getting angry, banging the table. None of that is beneficial towards the outcomes that you want to actually achieve in China. Even if you're the boss and you're managing, a team of local Chinese employees. All right? So we're trying to minimize the negative effects, which is 坏处 or 副作用. But internally, we're trying to understand the 心理打击. And this is the psychological impact Chinese behavior may have on us. All right? And again, back to the first thing, we're trying to prevent our interactions and our conversations from spiraling in a negative direction, which we say is 恶性循环. All right, so this infographic, which you can all download, represents the 10 chapters or the 10 Chinese cultural concepts in the Chinese Honeymoon Period. All right, and the real key about this, and we'll of course get into more details later, is our goal is to figure out what type of mindset do we need to develop to be successful in the Chinese arena. All right, mindset is 思维. What type of attitude should we develop or adopt in order to set a more positive tone when we're collaborating or working or partnering with people in China? And that is your 心态, which is actually what we're going to talk about in today's meetup. And then, of course, what is our approach? 方法. So I always just refer to these as the things that we want to adjust are our attitude, mindset, and approach. 心态, 思维和方法. And the goal really is, we can say in English that it's a roadmap for more constructive communications, but really what we want to do is we just want to 做好关系. We just want to develop the more productive and positive relationships that we need, or Guanxi relationships that we need to be successful operating in China. All right. So this is another illustration of the danger or the risk of thinking in English and then translating into Chinese, even through the help of a translator, as a way to get your message across. Okay. So if I look at this statement in Chinese, 改变咱们交流的方法和默契. That basically means, how do we change our approach to create better chemistry and cooperation? All right. And if I wanted to say change our approach to create better chemistry and cooperation, I might use this Chinese phrase, or I might tell my translator, if I didn't speak Chinese, to say that. Okay. The problem is that doesn't really convey the right message across. All right. And let me explain why. Okay. Instead of 交流, which is to interact, you can also say 沟通, which is to communicate. Okay. Instead of 咱们, which is what people might say in the northern part of China, you could say 我们. All right. Instead of saying 改变, which is to change, you can say 改进, which is to improve. All right. So many things that you can change and translate. And instead of 交流的方法和默契, most people would probably just say 关系. All right. So you can just use this phrase and replace that with everything else that you wanted to translate. Instead of improve our Guanxi, you would just say 做好关系. All right. Just develop closer or better Guanxi relationships. And this is where understanding things in the proper cultural context will help you begin to empathize. And empathy is one of the key ingredients to being successful with how Chinese people think, right? Imagine you know how Chinese people think, how they feel, and how they're likely to behave. Well, if you have that information, then you should be able to control the outcome of almost every situation. All right. So This provides you, these 10 Chinese cultural concepts, 10 chapters, provide you a solid foundation on how to improve how you communicate and collaborate with your Chinese partners. Today, we're going to talk about Xīntài, which is directly translated as attitude. Okay, so this is, I think this is chapter 8. This is their attitude. They're referring to your Chinese employees, partners, or counterparts. And we always start with a practical definition. All right. And I wanted to say, first of all, that I think this attitude chapter, this is the most challenging to actually understand. And it's also probably the most difficult when you're to engage with. All right. Understanding Chinese attitudes, because from our Western point of view, a lot of Chinese attitudes have become very nationalistic, very belligerent, almost very unacceptable, depending on the topic of conversation, which is why this is such a challenge for Westerners. Because on the one hand, we want to show our strength. We don't want to give up our quote unquote position. We don't want to give up our authority wherever we may have it. But how do we do that without creating an escalating 恶性循环? All right, so that's what we're going to talk about. So the practical definition of 心态 or attitude is it's an attitude and corresponding worldview that's derived from a person's upbringing and environment in which they were raised. So you can see during the introduction portion, I discussed the environment in which I was raised because I wanted to provide context for things that I say that might actually be upsetting to them. All right. So, but we also have to understand in the opposite direction, their attitude and corresponding worldview also comes from their environment. And we should always kind of assume that it's immutable, which means we don't want to enter any relationship with someone in China with the purpose to actually change the way they think, to change their worldview or perspective. That may happen over time, but it will rarely happen because you deliberately set out to make it happen. So we want to assume that it's immutable. That's a good mindset to have. All right, so let's look at the word attitude. Attitude can also be translated as 态度, which is a noun. Okay, that is a person's literal attitude. But this is kind of not what we're trying to capture here in understanding the proper Chinese cultural context. We're trying to capture what is the 心态 of our counterpart in China. What is their psychology? What is their mentality? And what is their way of thinking? All right. The other key word in this practical definition is worldview. All right. So worldview, literally translated as 世界观. Okay, that's just the literal translation of a person's worldview. But what we really want to focus on is 一个人的看法. All right, we want to focus on the other person's 看法, which is their way of looking at things. It is their opinion and their perspective. All right, even though it may be very rigid and immutable, it is their way of thinking and way of looking at things. It's their perspective. And that's the thing that we really need to focus on from a mindset perspective, because once we start trying to challenge somebody's worldview, it opens all kinds of difficulties and bad things if we try to challenge somebody's worldview. Immutable. All right, so immutable, we all know in English what that means, but to try to translate into Chinese, it probably is reflected in the word stubborn, which is 固执. All right, it means that they are stubborn, which is how you're going to feel when you're trying to persuade them or convince them of something, because they're fixated on or they cling to some dogma that they've been led to believe. And from our point of view, that's okay. Everybody's entitled to have their faith and believe in what they want to believe. So we shouldn't be judge and jury of what they are fixated on or what they choose to believe. Ultimately, when we talk about immutable, we're talking about 面子. Okay. There's one thing that Chinese people value more than anything else, and that is their face. their honor, their reputation, their self-respect. You can disagree with all of their politics and all of their beliefs, but you have to be conscientious that you're able to give face, because if you can't, then you might as well not be in China. You might as well decide to withdraw from China and not try to take advantage of the opportunities there. But once you're there and you've decided that I want to be there because there are opportunities for my business, for myself, then you really need to understand how to give face, which is honor, respect, and, a person's reputation. All right. Now, the influencing factors for a person's attitude, or a Chinese person's attitude, it includes a mixture of many factors that we're actually going to cover here. Some of them are psychological, that we talked about when we talked about the art of war, and the number one thing that we're trying to address with all of these workshops and books and stuff like that. Some of the factors are emotional, and some of them are spiritual. Just assume that it's what they believe. All right. So if you believe and pray to God, then that is something that is immutable. Your foundation will always be based on that. So you can assume that your counterpart who aspires to a different deity has a similar type of immutability as far as their beliefs. And the question is, how do we empathize with that? How do we understand that? And how do we collaborate and cooperate and engage with that? All right. So the insights that we really want to share, or we really want to think about, is when we talk about a person's Xīntài and a person's attitude, where does it come from? Okay. It's important to keep in mind that it comes from culture, which is different than ours. It comes from psychology, and it also comes from a person's EQ, or emotional quotient. You might discover that, relatively speaking, Chinese people don't really think about their EQ, and they're much more emotional about things that cause them disrespect. And that, of course, is the need for face. So you can actually lump all this in as cultural and psychological. All right. So for our point of view, what is the best way to engage with the Chinese attitudes? All right. Again, keep in mind, Chinese attitudes that we're not trying to change. We're trying to figure out how best do we engage with it. It will probably change naturally over time, but that's not our job. Our job is to figure out how best to engage with it, how best to cooperate with it, and how best to set a positive tone for every one of our interactions and engagements. And your attention should be on their face, okay? And your attention should just be on giving face in general, giving face, receiving face. And if you're a leader in China, helping all of your stakeholders preserve face. Okay. It encapsulates every aspect of Chinese life, social life, this face and mianzi. So your fundamental attention should be on this aspect in order to best engage with Chinese attitudes that you may not disagree with or that you find frustrating. All right. And in order to do that, these are the things that we work on in these workshops and these meetup events. And of course, we really stress in the thought exercises and the empathy exercises is, how do we develop greater cultural awareness? And of course, I hope the book and these meetup events are helping you do that. And how do you develop greater empathy? Because imagine the insight that you have when you know how other people think and feel and how they're likely to respond and behave. That's tremendous insight if you're going over for negotiations. But these are skills that we need to develop: cultural awareness and empathy. All right, so this is the overview. All right, so Xīntài is an attitude and corresponding worldview that's derived from a person's upbringing and the environment in which they were raised. All right, and I'm not going to read this, but this is basically all in the book. Okay, while I'm going to read the last sentence. How about that? While the way Chinese people choose to express themselves may get lost in translation, their attitude and how they feel should not be. Okay, that's the key lesson And that's the key point. Empathize with how Chinese people feel, and you will be able to open the door to unimaginable opportunities, cooperation, and basically all the riches that China has to offer. All right. Okay, so a quick review of where we are right now. So last week, I think we did how they feel, 委屈, and then we also talked about 焦虑, things that we affect directly and things we affect indirectly. Today we talked about right in the middle of this roadmap for more constructive communication patterns in China is their attitude. We have two more. One is their thinking, which is chapter 9, and the last one is 台阶下, which is preserving face, and that'll be the final chapter of this book.